Hey friends, welcome back to the Guitar Max channel, and this video is part one of my interview with Impellitteri bassist James Pulli. Hopefully a lot of you have seen my interview clips with Chris Impellitteri, and what's interesting is James, the bass player, he's been in the band the longest aside from Chris Impellitteri, and James has been in the band now for 30 years. This interview overall, and this portion of it in particular, I think is going to be really useful for anybody who wants to have a career as a musician, not just bass players, but really any musician. James gives just some vital advice, and he shares the kind of stuff that he wishes that he had known when he was starting out. He goes back to his original audition with the band Impellitteri and how he got that gig and how he has maintained and grown his career over the past 30 years. And he even shares the story of the time that he was hypnotized in order to prepare him for a big show. All right, guys, real quick, I hope you enjoy videos like this. And if you do and you have not already subscribed, please consider subscribing right now. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into part one of my interview with Impellitteri bassist James Pulli. James.
Max.
Dude.
A pleasure meeting you.
Likewise,
Absolutely.
Man, likewise. Thanks for doing the interview. And, I think a lot of people on the channel recently have seen my interview with Chris Impellitteri.
Absolutely.
And one of the things I was talking to him about is the guy that's been in the band the longest, aside from Chris,
right,
is you, James Pulli on bass. And obviously you've done a lot of other things, which, I want to talk to you about too. But,
sure.
Yeah, man, just welcome and thanks for doing the interview.
Thank you for listening to me.
Of course. So, I think we should just kind of start with Impellitteri, the band, right?
Sure.
You've been in the band early 90s, right? 92?
Yeah, 30 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I was looking up recently, I was going back to where, the first EP was done. I'm like 93. Okay, wow. All right, that's 30 years. So,
yeah.
I joined the band just before that EP. Just before.
How did that first meeting come about? I mean, did you know Chris before that? Like, how did that happen?
Wasn't familiar with him in the music, but as all musicians back then in LA, I was looking through Music Connection. I'd always go right to where the auditions were. I'd be like, oh, okay. Chris Impellitteri, Rob Rock, looking for drummer and bass player. I'm like, okay, all right, call the management company. I'd be there Thursday at 4 o'clock. Okay, all right. Show up there. It was at Mate's rehearsal, and I could see other bass players kind of going in and out, and I put my ear up to the door a little bit, and like, oh wow, okay, and it's some good cats there playing,
right.
Without a doubt. But I could tell. I learned the songs, and I could tell that some of these guys were doing like hammer-ons and playing kind of fast. I'm like, I don't do that. I mean, okay, we'll see how it goes. But I went in there. And I think what Chris and Rob really liked is I played basic. I supported what he needed. I was a bass player,
right.
Good tone, and just kind of supported the music so he could like launch off and do all his what he does. And it went really well. And then they were saying, okay, so we're going to audition drummers later today. Do you want to stick around and kind of audition the drums? Like, yeah, sure, great. And all I can remember from that audition is I'd never seen anybody play like Chris did in person, right? I've seen videos, I'm like, oh yeah, that guy's really good. But to watch him play right in front of me and hear him, his amp screaming on the side, I'm like, wow, I was really impressed. And Rob, hearing him sing during an audition, like it was, a festival in front of 200,000 people.
Yeah.
I got chills right now remembering it, but I got chills hearing him like, and I'd never heard a singer like that in person during a rehearsal at Mate's. These guys were obviously, top notch, and I wanted to be a big part of it. And a funny thing is too, at that point, I was really into House of Lords and the Sahara album. For some reason, I was really like obsessing with that. And I remember hearing the one opening line that was like super fast, and I'm thinking, guitar line. I'm like, I would love to work with somebody like that. As I'm out here in LA just learning. And I only found out years later that was Chris Impellitteri on the opening to Sahara, this really fast line. And of course, destiny would have it, I wind up being his bass player for so long. But I only learned later on when he said, oh yeah, I played on that album. I'm like, oh, I started looking it up. I'm like, oh my God, that is you. So it's interesting there. So I wound up auditioning drummers as well. And that I could kind of tell that at that point I was in, because
Right.
it was, well, hey, tomorrow we're going to audition a few more drummers. You want to come by? I'm like, yeah, sure.
Right.
Sure.
So how, I mean, first of all, I think that's really like, encouraging in to hear that it was like that, because there's so many people who are like, oh, well, I knew this guy, and people, even today, they're always like, oh, you have to know people already. And, but the idea that you can just show up to an audition and get the gig like that.
With other bass players, and it's
With
like, I can't do that. I'm just going to do
Right.
what I do.
Yeah.
Stay true to yourself, and
Yeah.
as a bass player, play solid, because that's what most artists are looking for.
So at that point, how long had you been like a bass player, like looking for gigs and that kind of stuff?
Okay. So I grew up in Pennsylvania, came out to California, always wanted to move to California. So I moved out to California in 84, right? I went to Musicians Institute in 84, 85, went back home for a short period of time, came back out. So when I came back out in 88, 89, that was when I really just wanted a full on, I know what I want to do. I want to be in a band. I want to be in a professional band. I want to record and tour, and I want to play. I just want to play all the time, because I had been in clubs back east doing, just slogging through the club circuit, and I wanted to come to LA and make it big like everyone else wanted to at that point.
When people look at you and they look at like your work in Impellitteri, I mean, something that jumps out to me is just how long you've been doing it and how long you've been in the same band.
Right.
And even guys that maybe have a few years of big success, it doesn't always last.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And either the band itself implodes, or they get distracted with something else, right?
Right.
What do you think is the key to the key to longevity in a band? And I'm thinking about things like being able to get along with the same group of guys for a long time.
Huge.
And then at the same time, musically, continuing to be like excited about what you're doing and that kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, with Impellitteri, I always felt like I was trying to keep up with the drummer and Chris. So it made me always want to practice more, get better. So it was very inspiring to me in that way. The other big thing is just my friendship with Chris. We get along really well. We like the same bands. We get along really well musically. I learned so much from Chris. In the early days, I would have to, if you can imagine, tracking next to him. So it's his studio. He's got the 2-inch tape going, and I'm playing bass to his guitar lines and the drummers and everything going on when we would do overdubs and whatnot. And he'd be like, "No, that wasn't quite in. That was not quite locking with the kick." And I'd be like rolling my eyes, and I'd start to get kind of upset and like. And then he would say, "No, do it again, do it again." And then so over time, I realized he was always right. He was always right about getting it tight with the kick and tuning. He was he was really, really nitpicking about tuning, which is great, because now it really molded me for everything I'm doing nowadays.
Yeah.
I know if I'm playing with the kick or not, and I know if it's in tune or something's not working out, because of Chris really being that diligent about it. And at the time, I might have been a bit discouraged and upset, like I can't do this, to where I kind of evolved into this awareness that he was always right, and I respect that. And even things like tone and what bass I should get and amp. I have a funny amp story if you want a quick
Yeah.
All right, so the first EP, I just joined the band. I had this massive bass setup that I used live. I would be playing at FM station, and I had like 415s and this big rack and a preamp and a Crown power amp, and I'd reel all this stuff. That's what I used for the audition. So it's like, that's not going to cut it for recording. So we get into to do the EP at Chris's studio at the time on Weddington, and he's like, "Oh, I rented you an SVT. We're going to use the SVT." I'm like, "Oh, okay." All right. He could have said Chrysler to me.
Right.
So he's like, "It's in there. Go ahead and get familiar with it and go do your setup there." And I walk in. At the time, it was with this bass.
Okay.
I walk in, there's SVT. It might as well have been a refrigerator with 64 knobs on it. I had no idea. All right, but I know, but SVT, that's the standard. You got to, it's a tube amp, you got to do that. So I started fiddling around. I'm like, I got a pretty good tone, but that was the funny thing, is like, you're used to that, right? Oh yeah, I'll go in, I'll take care of it.
No problem.
I'll get you a great bass tone here, and I'm like, oh man, twiddling around. But we it obviously worked out pretty good, good. And it was a really fun experience doing that first EP.
So you mentioned tuning, right?
Yeah.
So it's something I think it's more of a concern with bass players and guitar players, but there's a certain thing that happens, right, where if you're really pushing the strings, like the more aggressive you play, the more the tuning varies or something, where it starts out sharp. Like if you hit a note really hard, it starts out sharp and comes down, right? So did things like that? I mean, did your technique sort of change along with, like as you're learning these, these things and playing on these recordings? Did it make changes in your technique as well as your tonal taste or whatever?
I wouldn't say to correct tuning, because we would learn as another Chris trick. He would say, no, you got to look at the tuner, you got to hit it really aggressively and watch where it's peaking. Like, oh, okay. And then he would do that. I'd watch him do it. He's like, watch where it's peaking, not let it, if you just go bink, bink, whatever. Yeah. He's like, no, you're going to hit it like you're playing and watch where it's peaking. Oh, that's sharp, that's flat, that's sharp. So then I would learn to do that. So now when I tune, I hit the way you would be playing the song, and make sure that you're tuning towards or that kind of peaking in that way.
Okay, that's really good. All right. So what about obviously, like you're saying, being in that band is inspiring because of the level of ability of the band. What about obviously recording and touring and traveling and all this stuff? To do that for decades. You got any advice for people who are looking on ways to deal with that stuff? Like there's so many hurry up and wait situations, right?
Right. There are. Get into some kind of band. I'm also in a tribute band, and that band has taught me to deal with any chaos that can come up, because now you're dealing with 12 people on a Tuesday night, or 4,000 people in Monterrey, Mexico, or playing in Nicaragua with rented gear that has nothing to do with what you're doing, right? So I would say you have to get out there and play live. You have to get out there and play and play and play. Nothing replaces the whole idea of any situation where anything can come up. So I would say that my advice would be get into some kind of band that's playing a lot, and just deal with it and learn. You learn things, what you can put up with, what you can't. I've played sets where I couldn't hear myself at all, singing or playing. I've had sets where the guitar player is so damn loud I can't hear anything but this Marshall screaming in my ear. So that teaches you to overcome those things. Like, oh yeah, all right, I've done that. All right, I know I get into this mode, I can play it, I'll be okay, I'll be all right. So my advice would be just to get into some kind of band where you're playing a lot, and just learn that hey, it's rock and roll. Things are going to happen. I played this one show in Hermosa Beach where we were sharing the back line with a bunch of bands, and the bass player before me put his jacket over the head. And I come down from stairs and I'm ready, like, here's our set, I'm ready to go, I can't wait. And he's like, oh man, I think because my jacket was on there, it blew the head. It's not turning on again. What? There's nothing. I've had shows where, I'm talking like a big show like House of Blues in San Diego with tons of people there. And I flick on my SVT, which I've done 200 times, that year, flick it on and everything just sparks and goes dead. I'm like, and I mean, that was just the standby. We were ready to go on. Right. And luckily I reached behind the amp, pulled up my spare, stuck it on top, plugged it in, ready to go. So my advice is be ready for anything.
And have a spare.
And always have a spare. I have spare basses, strings, I have spare heads, everything except cabinets, because you can always go through the house if you have to.
I've talked to a lot of people or known people who they have really bad first gigs, right? Like the first few gigs they have, and I think a lot of guys put too much weight on. Everybody wants to make a good first impression and things like that. Sure. But a lot of times the first gigs, if you put a new band together or you join a band and you're kind of learning the ropes of that band, the first gigs are some of the worst ones, I think.
Can be.
Right? But I've known a lot of guys who just get really discouraged by that, right? And they kind of lose. I feel like it's easy to focus on a single gig and feel like that's going to define everything I do.
Right.
You know, and forget about, no, it's, I mean, ideally you want this to be going on for many, many years, right?
Yeah, you just have the drive in you to like just understand. Well, and again, that comes with lots of practicing, lots of different gigs to like, well, that gig wasn't so good. All right, so the next one will be better. What went wrong? And this comes down to making or feeling blessed that you have guys in the band that you can talk to with no egos and say, hey, what happened? Was it, well, I couldn't hear your bass. I'm like, okay, well, we'll make sure next time you can hear my bass so we can, really get it tight. Luckily for me, the first gig with Impellitteri, which was right away after doing that EP, went to Japan in front, it was a big tour, right? First time I'd played in front of people like that, right? I even went, this is news, nobody else has ever heard this except probably my mother, but I went to a hypnotist like a month before, and I said, look, I got this gig. I don't know how I'm going to react.
Right.
I've played in front of 200 people, but this is going to be huge. Is there something you can do to make me feel at ease? And he gave me all these things, relaxation and little hypnotism here and there. It's like, but I'll tell you what, man, when you get up there and you hear the fans, those Japanese fans, they're the best, and they're just happy. You could do anything, and they're going to cheer. Right. So I'll tell you, from the first 5 seconds, I was like, no problem. I wasn't nervous. It was very easy. It was very easy. Plus, we had rehearsed, intensely. So it all went really, really well at that point.
So you didn't even need the hypnotist.
I didn't need it. That was $60 wasted.
Very LA. Very LA. Yeah. So after a gig, and maybe the gig doesn't go so well, you can talk to the guys and you can figure out what happened. So analyzing your past performances and looking for ways that you can make improvements and stuff. I mean, would you say that's an important thing?
If you want to progress, I think it's hugely important.
Okay.
Yeah, usually for me, it's just, man, you got to know the songs. You got to know the changes. Got to know the songs. Like, man, no matter how much time you put into it, sometimes it's not enough, especially with Impellitteri music. You heard Chris talk about all of his the Animetal gigs and how complicated they were. Like my hat goes off to Rudy for doing that. Usually, I mean, analyzing it, sometimes it has to do with hearing everything. Sometimes it has to do with your performance. For me, though, lately, as long as I can hear everything, it's going to be a great show.
Okay.
But if all I have is bass and a floor tom, it's not going to go too well. Yeah. So you try to make sure you have the time to put into a sound check to make that happen. But sometimes, like on festivals, you don't always have that luxury. You get up there and you got 10 minutes to plug in and kick ass. So
right. Well, I mean, I bring that up because I think a lot of guys just don't like to face when they make a mistake, right? Singers are notorious for this, right? You try hey, I think we came in, a bar early on that bridge or something. It's like, oh, well, I don't know, maybe, but we'll deal with it next time, right? Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes was from Roger Daltrey, and he said, "I'll take a bead of sweat and a sour note anytime over a perfect performance." Meaning, like if you're up there doing all you can and you play a wrong note.
Yeah.
There was a band I followed back when I was young, and I remember watching the singer, and he was really good. And a couple of times he didn't quite hit the note, and he just kind of went like that. Yeah. I'm like, that's the attitude. That's what you got to do. Just trudge on. One of the bass teachers at MI, he said, when something goes wrong, just pull up the waders and trudge through. Just keep going. Yeah. Because he got, from what I remember, this will be really quick, but he was playing for this Russian wedding, and he had never played any Russian music. And he started out with like jazz standards, and then they're like, "Oh, come on, play the Russian music." And he had no idea what he was doing. He says, "At that point, I just pulled up my waders and trudged through, and I just kind of faked some notes and did what I could." As always, the show must go on.
Yeah. I think there's something too, like musicians when they're starting out and they have stage fright or they get nervous or whatever. There's something about being on stage in front of an audience that automatically like lends you more credibility.
Oh, sure.
Like with the audience, right? So it's like you can go up there and you can half the notes you play can be wrong, you know, but it's like, well, maybe he intended to do that, you know. It's
Right. There are no wrong notes. There's 13 notes. None of them are wrong.
Yeah.
You know, they're all in the key.
Maybe not the one you intended, but that's okay.
Right. That's it. You have to have the attitude. You have to, even if you play a wrong note, and I've learned this before from, I don't know who I learned it from, but if you play a wrong note, the next time around, play that same wrong note.
Yeah.
Right? So then it just sounds, he wanted to do that. It's like a
Jazzy.
flat 13th there, really?
Yeah.
Wow, I know. Oh, all right, I like him even more.
Yeah.
So it's attitude, especially in our world with metal music. It's all about just playing with attitude.
So how about, you know, when you were, like in the early days of Impellitteri or when you were at MI, like, what are the things that you learned 15 or 20 years later that you wish you'd known more about starting out, right?
That's a good question.
You know, the classic thing of like, if you could go back in time and talk to yourself and give yourself like, hey, you know, pay attention to this more, or don't, you're worrying too much about that, don't worry about it, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Wow. Some of it, like I wish when I first got into MI, I would have just disregarded, because I was really into the curriculum. I want to learn to play stand-up.
Right.
I want to play jazz standards. I want to read. I want to be a really good reader. And I should have, at that time, the metal scene was blossoming in Hollywood. You know, you're talking about Motley Crue, Van Halen, and everything was going down. And I'm stuck in my cubicle learning, you know, what scale to play over a F minor, second diminished, whatever. And I should have been out, you know, really walking the streets and auditioning for metal bands, but that didn't happen. But other things I wish I had done, you know, pay attention to your tone kind of early, really work on tone, because that'll set you apart. When I first moved to LA, I had a Rickenbacker 4001, because I was a Getty fan and Chris Squire fan. So I'm like, well, this is the best bass of anything. And then you get into MI and you realize, okay, those are kind of limiting tones for everything. So I wound up selling my Rick so that I could, I bought a plane ticket home for Christmas one year. I sold my Rick and bought this bass, this old P bass. And this is far more versatile. This works for everything. This works for all kinds of music. Even when a band's on Access TV or any kind of show, I ask my wife, honey, what is that? Oh, that's a P bass and an SVT. I'm like, that's right? Because it works for everything. So I wound up selling my Rick, got a P bass. So paying attention to your tone, it will set you apart, I think. And just being ready, you know, just being ready for anything and be open to anything and do as many auditions, as many tryouts as you can, play with as many people as you can. Like if you play with one band for 15 years, you know, you're going to be kind of limited in your experience. So I would say if you're in a place where you can play with a lot of different bands, a lot of different musicians, it's just going to expand your horizons, I would say.
So maybe, you know, people have a tendency to overthink, like, oh, maybe I could join this band, but, you know, I don't like this or I don't like that. But it might not be an ideal situation, but you're still going to benefit from the experience, right?
Yeah, I think so. There was a couple of bands where you get that call and it's like, hey, James, we could really use you if you want to come by and practice on Thursday. And I go, oh, what's it like? What's going on? I'm like, I don't really want to spend the time, but then I kind of look at the songs. Here's a really good example. The singer for Led Zeppelin, Swan, he's a phenomenal singer. I love the tribute band Zeppelin, and he wanted to do a Robert Plant solo project, you know, do just his solo music. And I'm like, that's a lot of music to learn. Well, I have to play fretless live, which is, you know, that was very daunting to me, but it happened during COVID, luckily, and I really put some time into it, and I didn't want to do it, but I knew, you know what, this is going to be good for me. No matter what, it's going to be really good for me. I had to buy pedals. I'm not a pedal guy.
Right.
I have my bass, a chord, and an SVT, and a Let's Rip, you know. But I had to buy all these pedals, so I had to learn how to, you know, work these pedals during a show. I had to really kind of work. I had 4 different basses I had to use on stage, but it really just opened up my mind to a lot of different things that I wasn't open to before. And thank God I answered that call and I did it, because now playing live fretless, I'm not terrified anymore.
Right.
Now I can do it. Now I can do it, I feel. So yeah, I'd say agree to what feels good, even if it doesn't feel good, try it.
Right.
And again, it's always about being prepared. Oh yeah, I remember I did this on that gig and I overcame it, and oh, that didn't go so bad. I thought this was going to be terrible, but it was, worked out okay. All those kind of things are, I think, very important to learn and overcome in a career.
Okay, guys, so that was part 1 of my interview with James Pulli, and I think a few of the really big takeaways here is how important the other people that you play with are in terms of how much of an impact they have on you. One of the big things James said in there was that he has been continually inspired as a musician because the other musicians that he plays with are playing at such a high level. He was talking about keeping up, right, with the other guys in the band. You guys have probably heard the saying, if you're the smartest person in the room, then it's time to find another room. I think the same idea kind of applies to musicians, right? You don't always want to be the best musician in the band. The other big point that he was making is just the value in playing a lot, and playing often, and playing a variety of gigs, and just getting as much experience as you can as a musician. Okay guys, part 2 is going to be coming up soon, but that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll talk to you soon.